The Considered Life by Stéphane Boublil. Chapter 16. History. It's funny how we tend to remember the past, at least in history books, mostly in terms of good and bad. We know who the bad guys are, and we know that out of nowhere, good guys inevitably emerge to save civilization from doom. History tends to be seen in clashing terms because it is convenient for those looking to fashion heroes and scapegoats to see it that way. Yet it's not entirely useful for those thirsty to learn from events past. History, much like Earth once was, is flat. Its peaks and valleys only the result of hindsight. Stuck as we have ever been in a mud of binary opposition, and as useful as it can be in misguidedly assigning value to quotidian events, history seems less than fit for chronicling the days before today. We must consider history at first to be a boring class on evidentiary findings and not the epic poem the Discovery and National Geographic channels need us to believe it is. The world of yesterday, whether populated by knights around a table, bicorn-led French armies, or mustachioed German theoretical physicists, is as shaded in gray as today's, filled with hesitation, fear, inner conflict, love, experiments, care, and disregard. The long-forgotten yet necessary component of the oft-recounted past is humanity. Basic, flawed, thoughtful, and born of considered desire to merely do. Action whose motives are seldom sought after in the books, classes, and lectures we have been told we need to understand in order not to repeat. But what do they really teach us, other than timelines? What have we really discovered over the bench-pressed years of formal education, other than an odd ability to memorize an entire century's worth of war dates? History is knowledge acquired by investigation. And when was the last time we didn't take someone else's word for what happened to the poilu at Verdun, to Alexander the Great's mother, to Neanderthal man? Well, okay, fine. We're not all willing to go dig in the soils of antiquity in order to find our own version of the facts, but we do all share one attribute that can, and often does, advance our cause. Curiosity. Again. We are as curious about the people of history as they were about those who came before them. All of us itching to find prologues to our interminable chapters, reasons, motives, intentions, purpose, so that we may know that we are not alone. Not without direction. It is within those calculations, boosted and frayed by ego, that history can be found, and from which our own inspiration can spring. We tend to forget that behind the proclamations of the Napoleons, the Hitlers, the Lincolns, the Butos, behind the signed treaties, the declarations of war and hope, there are people who were moved, not yet by still-to-be-written history, but by emotions which gave way to curiosity and eventually actions all too familiar to every one of us. Jealousy, revenge, ambition, entitlement, all mundane instincts to which we lowly commoners react every day. Let us not forget that the people who now populate glossaries and bibliographies the world over did not yet understand their destiny, but lived in their present, their accomplishments ultimately judged against moral ladders yet unknown to them. Of course, history would be nothing without its figures, but why do we prefer them simply as statues, both in bronze and metaphor, in the intended parks of our cities and memories, instead of the living organisms they once were? Let me attempt to explain. What we, the casual removed observers of history, read in our precious school books is akin to reducing Louis Pasteur's motivation to, how can I do the body good? Or Adolf Hitler's to, I want to invade Poland so bad. If perhaps not in those words exactly. The reasons, however, for any individual or group wanting to make history are largely ignored because we have already categorized them, with the benefit of hindsight and nearsighted acceptance of popular opinion, as either good or bad. Of course, between the achievements of Pasteur and the atrocities of Hitler, the choice is understandably categorical. But for all those in between, the stories must be searched to appreciate not only the facts as reported, but the people behind them. That is the only path to understanding, and if we're lucky, learning and considering its implications for the present. History is not monolithic, but is in fact as much about what happened in our preceding second as in the events of 1,000,000 years ago. The colloquialism in which something or someone is said to be history makes little sense, for history is, if anything, prologue, not epilogue. History is one of our few well-sharpened tools for knowledge, and probably our only able tool for teaching. As a matter of fact, it is the only bank of information that we can look into for guidance, with any amount of confidence as to the validity of the data. The future is left to the diviners of our time to predict, but the past, with able documentation, is, for lack of a better play on words, present? That is comforting to know, but it is not the whole picture. What is bothersome in considering it a closed chapter is that we assume that history is not alive. We believe in the record as a sequence of events that is dormant, yet there are always new details to be uncovered about the past. And not just about previously overlooked hieroglyphs opening a new understanding of how the ancient Egyptians may have built pyramids, but also about the last few moments. Case in point, were we now in the same room and you had to describe my last 10 minutes, you would probably characterize it as a waste of time, observing me as you did, constantly shifting from word processing to Twitter to mechstories.com to fetching nuts and water to emptying the dishwasher to changing the music to checking if any of my apps had an update available. Well, shut up, Dad. Where you see attention deficit, I willfully practice the art of distraction, necessary to a process built on discovering what I create anew, every few moments, that which gives me fresh perspective every time I look. Systematic unfocusing being my key to accomplishment, yet seen from the onlooker's eyes as misuse. Why? Because my angle, emotional state, and interpretation predicated on a life lived unlike yours gives me, by definition, another point of view, another story which guides my intentions. You have your version, I have mine, and 6 billion more have theirs. The recounting of history depends on collecting as many of these points of view as possible to be accurate. When we talk about historians and assume they are telling us the facts, we are wittingly bamboozled by persons whose job it is to objectively relay, yet, by mere virtue of having also borne a single entity, do so only based on what they have found out. 10 years later, there will undoubtedly be another book written by another PhD who will claim to have uncovered heretofore unknown particulars about the same subject, which will put into question the previous author, his findings, his methodology, in short, him. An undoubtedly unfair assessment. 10 years later, the same story will repeat with a new ending. History depends largely on the point of view of the reporter, not simply on a series of events supposedly anchored in time. Here's an example, at random. The nature of the creative brief for the much-coveted Bible job was not historical in kind, but rather a transmedia marketing project. Leaving biblical inerrancy aside for a minute, we have to wonder about the writer's intent. Was it written as a history book? Was it supposed to sell an idea? Was it assembled by imperial decree to further a political agenda? How did the personal life of the writers interfere with their subject, as often is the case in any kind of journalistic endeavor? These questions, and more importantly their answers, unquestionably color how history is recounted. When you are telling the story of creation and the purported meaning of life, you inevitably have to count on others' descriptions, who themselves got bits and pieces from others, who obtained their own bits and pieces from earlier ones. In fact, playing a giant game of telephone across time, in which the last person to relay is gargling the story back up using their own perspective, their own filter, filling holes left void by the very nature of the game. The Gospels make it easy to notice such inconsistencies between them, whether it is the vagaries of Jesus' death, place, and time, the order of creation, or how many times the cock crowed. Obviously, the editors of the Bible read this material, reread it again and again, and still allowed the conflicting material in. King James, often called the wisest fool in Christendom, convened, it is said, up to 47 scholars to fit the text into the belief system of the newly formed Church of England, producing the volume hailed as the official version of the Holy Text for all Christians to this day. Bizarre, no? Such is the way of history writing. Imperfect, incomplete by nature, and unreasonably greeted as factual when related with enough beard, authority, or age. Very few people and too few historians insist on looking at times past, near or far, from different points of view. preferring instead to profess absolute conviction from one side or the other of our insufficient binary equation? Is it so crazy to think that transcribers may have faulty memories and that, in order not to piss off their bosses, whether emperors or CEOs, they will recount a believable version of events instead of digging further for what may have actually happened and why? Or, God forbid, admit to failure? Is it so wild an idea to think that when Greek historian Plutarch sat down to tell the story of Alexander the Great over 400 years after his protagonist's death, he may not have had all the pieces of the puzzle and made up the missing ones? Is it possible that when he assures us that the undoubtable conqueror had, quote, almost the most complete mastery of his appetite, unquote, that even when, quote, offered bakers and cooks reputed to be very skillful, he said he wanted none of them, unquote, he just may have sprinkled a bit of irresistible detail that any skilled narrator would have added in order to make his character more compelling? Much like a book cover is an artist's interpretation of someone else's words, so are we supposed to interpret the storyteller's tale. We judge books by their covers, and so must we history by its writers. Books, in fact, have been for that reason one of the major definers of culture, for they give us the ability to communicate beyond time. Whether fiction or non, the writer records a point of view, hopefully understood as such when clashed with another's, ours. And the meeting of these two points of view results in an explosion that propels us into an imaginary version of the past, for which no costume epic drama will ever be a match. As such, history becomes a source of data, one among many others, from Wikipedia pages to conversations around teen biscuits at our grandparents', to be treated with equal measure of respect and doubt. The outcome is, again and thankfully, curiosity for a world unjustifiable from any single reference, that which presents to us the most interesting parts according to their authors, whether it be the invasion of Carthage or Hogwarts, which we can either learn from or be inspired to build. Much of the goal of this very book, in fact, to confirm thoughts you might already have had or give you ample ammunition to shoot me down. But please remain civil. If there is any point to considering one's life, it may be to do the best with what we have. But in order to do that, we need to understand what we have. History is of great help in this quest, as it is not a list of mere facts and dates, but rather an alarm clock, a wake-up call to the compendium of all things we are most capable of as a species, an anthology of all behaviors, normal and strange, celebrated and punished, public or private, available for us to either repeat or remix. The kids in Plato's cave, our communal guinea pigs, prove that early on as a society, some felt a need to rouse others from the perceived opacity of life, crafting silly, limited, often underachieving or overambitious stories that baited us not to merely listen and acquiesce, but ask ourselves if we were using every part of ourselves to its full capacity. The answer begs us to consider our lives, be more attentive to our processes, be present in the face of history, so that we may take part in it. Thinking of history as a non-fluctuating timeline is comfortable, because living as we do in a disposable culture gives us a constant, something we can rely on with certitude, something that shows an unmistakable relationship to the past. And books are a fantastic way to display such conviction to our friends and family. The reason why the bookcase has become our altar of personal culture, at which we ask people to worship our breadth of knowledge and interests, furthermore aggrandized if we can list all such erudition on websites and social networks, with millions of potential admirers of the place we believe to have staked in history. Quickly flattered, we become collectors of moments, recounting them at will from facts not experienced, fetishists among so many dealing in repetition instead of production. Their words, not ours. What is extraordinary is that the work of these raconteurs, turning a phrase, innocently enough perhaps, can influence the thoughts and actions of an entire planet's inhabitants for millennia. Do they mean to do it? Do they know what they are doing and why they are doing it? No, of course not. How could they? These days, when history happens, it is covered from every angle in high definition and comes packaged with instantly digitized punditry. There is no more fear of ancient libraries burning down at the whim of a capricious pope, or film stock decomposing in moist vaults. There can never be another worry about history being lost from memory because we weren't there to witness it. From this time forth, we take history for granted, see it as complete information, ready to eat and shit back out, and see no need to look further and meet at the border of the other person's imagination, so that we may be curious again about what happened. History has become both useless and meaningless. Ironically, it is because we have pretended to make it exact, fancying ourselves the worst kind of perfectible completists, that we have stripped present history of its impact and importance as a launcher of inquiry instead of a mere witness stand. A considered view of history is one that takes both personal context and the human experience at large into account. It is impossible to look at either exclusively, because history is made by humans, capricious and imperfect, not by figures. The lore of history is a quest set forth millennia ago in order to understand why we are the way we are. And I think that if ever a time machine was invented and we could go back to look at the reasons why humans did the things they did, we might be surprised to discover the context-specific motives for those decisions. Which is why it is impossible to rewrite history, to right wrongs. Because history happens for personal reasons, willed into existence by the people willing it. We have this grand and overestimated vision of ourselves, a movie in which we are the heroes, and we do the right thing, and cast out the evildoers. But an axis of evil, as extraordinary a marketing tool as it is too simple a device, too naive to reasonably explain humanity's failings. It leaves out, of course, the necessity of evil for good to exist, whatever either represents for you. As a rule, it is said that history is written by the winners. That hardly sounds fair, does it? In fact, it does not sound like history at all, more like a first draft. Chances are, the loser's side is probably pretty interesting too, no matter the final tabulation. Living a considered life means thinking of yesterday as prologue, and using that knowledge to judge today and act tomorrow. That is a debt both useful and problematic, for we may reasonably feel that, since this is the way it has always been done, so must it be, again and again, and incentives for change disappear. History is not just pyramids and marching armies. It is also the communication of a pattern and a not-so-subtle nudge that if it has worked before, there is no reason it shouldn't again. That is for you to judge for yourself, of course. You cannot answer the call of the past with a predetermined yes every time, for written history is not necessarily truth. The past may have evolved in your own mind into a lie, effortlessly handed over by society, the media, or anybody with an agenda. You have to acknowledge that the version of the past you are not comfortable with is not yours, and your present needs to overhaul the bias inherent to remembering it that way. With dreams, the second you put them into words, you are actually interpreting, not recounting, the dream itself having long vanished in pure brain electricity. The same may be with history every time it is supposedly told again, done so through a prism defined by the speaker. It is possible that in the macrocosm of human history and the microcosm of one's individual life, there is almost no way to accurately give an account of history, for we do not retain information that way. We listen, we mix, we match, we invent, we make it fit. We imagine the past as well as the future. History is essential to our understanding of ourselves as a people. It is essential to understanding the dynamics of human successes and frailties. It is our only anchor, our only library, our only catalog of human experiences. It must be studied without judgment.